The convoy of military trucks churned through the muddy track, their engines growling as they drew closer to the encampment that would become a cage. Packed inside the canvas-covered beds sat German women, their bodies swaying with each jolt and bump, their faces set in expressions that tried to mask exhaustion as determination. These were not soldiers in the traditional sense, but they had served the Reich nonetheless. Nurses who had tended wounded men in field hospitals, clerks who had typed orders and filed documents, auxiliaries who had kept the machinery of war functioning in countless small ways. Their uniforms, once pressed and pristine, now bore the wrinkles and stains of defeat. Their boots, which had once clicked smartly across polished floors, were scuffed and thin at the soles. Yet despite the weariness that pulled at their shoulders and the hunger that gnawed at their bellies, they sat upright, spines rigid, chins raised. They would not give their captors the satisfaction of seeing them broken. When the trucks finally rumbled to a halt and the tailgates dropped with metallic clangs, the women climbed down into the pale sunlight of late afternoon. They assembled themselves into rough lines without being told, habit and training taking over even in defeat. The gates of the prisoner of war camp stood before them, chain link and barbed wire glinting in the sun, and beyond those gates they could see their captors waiting. The women braced themselves for what they had been taught to expect from the Americans: harsh discipline, perhaps violence, certainly the kind of rigid military protocol they understood. What they encountered instead left them bewildered. The American soldiers stood in loose formation, their postures relaxed in ways that would have earned reprimands in any German unit. Rifles rested casually against shoulders rather than being held at rigid attention. Helmets sat at careless angles, some pushed back on heads to reveal sweat-dampened hair. One guard had rolled his sleeves up past his elbows, exposing forearms bronzed by the sun and corded with muscle that spoke of farm work rather than military drilling. Another was chewing gum with mechanical rhythm, his jaw working steadily until he blew a bubble that expanded pink and translucent before bursting with a sound like a small firecracker. He didn't flinch, simply gathered the gum back into his mouth and resumed chewing. The German women stared. In their world, such casualness before prisoners would have been unthinkable, a sign of dangerous weakness. They had been raised to believe that their enemies would be as disciplined and severe as their own officers, that the machinery of the American military would operate with the same rigid efficiency they had known. Instead, they saw men who looked barely out of boyhood, leaning on their weapons as if they were farming implements, talking amongst themselves in easy voices that carried no edge of threat or authority. One soldier shifted his weight from foot to foot, clearly bored. Another yawned without bothering to cover his mouth. It started as a ripple, a barely suppressed sound from somewhere in the middle ranks of the assembled prisoners. Then it spread, a wave of laughter that grew as it moved through the lines of women. Some tried to stifle it, pressing hands over their mouths, but their shoulders shook with the effort. Others let it out more freely, sharp exhalations of amusement mixed with disbelief. The woman standing next to the brunette nurse leaned close and whispered in rapid German, her voice carrying equal parts contempt and bewilderment. "These are the soldiers who defeated us? These overgrown farm boys who can't even stand at proper attention?" Another prisoner, a blonde clerk who had once filed requisition forms in Berlin, pointed with a subtle movement of her chin toward the guard with the exposed forearms. "Look at that one," she murmured, her tone dripping with derision. "He looks like he should be ploughing fields, not guarding prisoners. Are we supposed to be intimidated by men who look like they've never left their villages?" The laughter continued, gaining confidence as the American guards failed to respond with anger or violence. The women had expected shouting, perhaps even blows for their insolence. In the camps they had known, any sign of disrespect toward authority would have been met with immediate and harsh punishment. But these Americans merely glanced at each other with expressions that ranged from mild amusement to sheepish acknowledgement. One guard, a lanky young man with prominent ears, actually grinned as if he found the whole situation funny himself, as if he were in on the joke rather than the target of it. This response, or rather this lack of proper response, was perhaps more unsettling than any punishment would have been. The women's laughter, which had started as a release of tension and an assertion of their remaining pride, began to take on a slightly uncertain edge. They were accustomed to a world where every action produced a predictable reaction, where the rules of military conduct were absolute and unchanging. But here in this camp, the rules seemed different, the reactions unpredictable. The Americans' patience, their apparent lack of concern about being mocked by prisoners, introduced an element of confusion into what should have been a straightforward dynamic of captor and captive. The brunette nurse, whose name was Greta, though none of the Americans yet knew it, felt the laughter die in her throat even as it continued around her. She studied the faces of the guards more carefully, trying to understand what she was seeing. There was no cruelty there, no barely suppressed rage waiting to explode. Instead, she saw weariness similar to her own, boredom, and something else she couldn't quite name. When a young guard tripped slightly on a root protruding from the packed earth, catching himself with an awkward stumble, fresh laughter erupted from the prisoners. But Greta noticed how the soldier simply shrugged and kept walking, how his companions ribbed him good-naturedly about it rather than punishing him for the display of clumsiness before prisoners. The women were eventually herded toward their assigned barracks, the guards directing them with gestures more than commands, their instructions delivered in voices that held no particular menace. As they walked through the camp, the prisoners continued to observe everything with sharp attention, cataloguing details that reinforced their initial assessment. The Americans were loud, casual, undisciplined by German standards. They called to each other using first names, jokes flying back and forth. There was none of the formal distance between ranks that had characterized every military installation the women had known. It all seemed so informal, so unmilitary, so strange. The barracks themselves were simple wooden structures, long and low, with rows of bunk beds lining the walls. The smell of fresh sawdust and soap hung in the air, not unpleasant but foreign after months of the acrid sense of war. Small windows punctuated the walls at regular intervals, and through them the women could see more of the camp, guard towers at the corners, more barracks, the mess hall, and in the distance, the Americans' own quarters where their captors would sleep. As the women claimed bunks and began to settle in, the whispered conversations continued. The mockery flowed easily now, each woman trying to outdo the others with cutting observations about their captors. They commented on the guards' accents, which sounded harsh and nasal to ears accustomed to the cadences of German. They laughed about the casual postures, the lack of proper military bearing, the way the Americans seemed to treat guard duty as though it were a casual job rather than a serious responsibility. One woman, a nurse who had served in a field hospital near the Eastern Front, declared loudly enough for others to hear, "I've seen schoolboys with more discipline than these so-called soldiers." Yet beneath the laughter and mockery, there stirred something else, something the women were not yet ready to acknowledge, even to themselves. The absence of cruelty was more disturbing than cruelty would have been. Violence and harshness were familiar, comprehensible. They had seen enough of both during the war to know how to steel themselves against it, how to endure it with dignity intact. But this strange tolerance, this apparent indifference to their mockery, this casual humanness in their captors, none of it fit into the framework they had been taught to understand. Greta claimed a lower bunk near one of the windows. As she spread the thin blanket she had been issued over the bare mattress, she found her gaze drawn to the scene outside. Evening was beginning to fall, painting the sky in shades of amber and rose. The guards had gathered in small groups, their duty rotations apparently shifting. They were sharing cigarettes, passing them around with easy familiarity. One produced a harmonica and began to play, the notes drifting across the compound, a simple melody, slightly melancholic but not sad, just contemplative. The others listened or talked softly amongst themselves, their voices carrying on the evening air but too distant for the words to be distinct. The women in the barracks gradually fell silent as darkness deepened outside. They lay on their bunks, each lost in her own thoughts, processing the strange reality of their first day in captivity. Some still whispered occasionally, keeping up the pretense of mockery, calling the guards foolish boys, questioning how such undisciplined men had managed to win a war. But the words came more slowly now, with less conviction, as exhaustion and confusion took their toll. Greta stared up at the wooden slats of the bunk above her, listening to the sounds filtering through the window, the harmonica still playing, male laughter that held no edge of cruelty, just genuine amusement at something she couldn't hear. She thought about the guard she had noticed during their arrival, the one with freckles scattered across his nose and cheekbones, whose eyes had flicked toward her for just an instant. She had expected to see contempt in that glance, the victor's disdain for the vanquished. Instead, what she had seen looked almost like curiosity, the same kind of wondering attention one might give to a puzzle or a question without an easy answer. She whispered to herself so quietly that even the woman on the bunk above couldn't hear. Fools. They must be fools. But her heart was beating faster than it should, her pulse elevated by something she couldn't name and didn't want to examine. She turned onto her side, pulling the scratchy blanket up over her shoulder, and closed her eyes against the confusion that threatened to overwhelm the certainty she had carried since being captured. Outside, the harmonica continued its simple tune, and the American voices rose and fell in rhythms of casual conversation. The women had arrived expecting to find monsters wearing human faces, demons who would exact revenge for the war. Instead, they had found young men who smiled easily, who laughed at themselves, who seemed more interested in their card games and cigarettes than in asserting their dominance over defeated enemies. The prisoners had laughed to mask their fear and maintain their pride, but now in the darkness, with no one watching, the first fine cracks had appeared in their certainty. Curiosity had begun its slow, insidious work, and curiosity, once awakened, was far more dangerous than hatred could ever be. What had started with ridicule was beginning its transformation into something else entirely, something that would prove far more threatening to the women's sense of themselves and their place in this new, confusing world. In the darkness, as sleep slowly claimed them, some of the women dreamed, not of home or of freedom, but of American faces, of freckles and blue eyes, of smiles that seemed to promise something their hearts weren't yet brave enough to want. Morning announced itself with the harsh clang of the camp bell, a sound that jerked the women from their restless sleep with the same efficiency as the alarms they had known in their previous lives. They rose stiffly from their bunks, bodies protesting the unfamiliar mattresses and the accumulated weariness of weeks of displacement. Despite their exhaustion, they assembled themselves quickly, falling into line for the morning roll call with the automatic precision of those trained in military routine. Their backs were straight, their chins up, their expressions carefully arranged into masks of defiance, even as their stomachs growled with hunger and their bodies ached from the hard beds. The guards moved along the lines with clipboards, checking names against their lists, calling out in mangled attempts at German pronunciation that made some of the prisoners wince. One American struggled particularly with the name Schweitzer, turning it into something that sounded more like Schwitzherr, and a ripple of suppressed giggles moved through the line. Another prisoner, standing just behind Greta, nudged her companion and nodded toward a guard whose helmet had slipped down over his eyebrows, giving him the appearance of a child playing dress-up in his father's military gear. The guard kept having to tilt his head back to see under the rim, his neck craned at an awkward angle that struck the women as absurdly comic. Someone else pointed out, barely moving her lips, how one soldier's boots appeared to be mismatched, one slightly darker than the other, as if he had dressed in a hurry or couldn't be bothered to maintain his equipment properly. The observations passed in rapid whispers down the line, each detail of American casualness or sloppiness becoming ammunition for their mockery. Laughter bubbled up again, though it was thinner now than it had been the previous day, lacking some of its initial sharp edge. There was something almost performative about it, as if the women were going through the motions of ridicule because it was expected, because it was what they had started and now felt obligated to continue. The Americans, for their part, continued to respond with the same maddening patience. They didn't shout or threaten. They simply carried on with their duties, calm and methodical, occasionally exchanging glances with each other that might have been amusement or might have been something else entirely. One guard, a stocky man with dark hair and a square jaw, actually smirked when he caught the tail end of the prisoners' laughter, as if acknowledging that yes, they probably did look ridiculous from a certain perspective. But what did it matter? The war was over. They had won. They could afford to be casual. This lack of retaliation, this refusal to play the role of stern, vengeful captor, continued to unsettle the women in ways they struggled to articulate. Every assumption they had made about what captivity would be like was being challenged. Where were the beatings they had been warned about? Where was the cruelty that propaganda had promised them American soldiers would inflict? The cognitive dissonance between expectation and reality created a strange tension that hung over the morning roll call like humidity before a storm. After the count was completed and the women officially accounted for, they were directed toward the camp kitchens to receive their morning meal. The building that housed the mess hall was larger than their barracks, a long structure with windows propped open to let out the heat from the cooking stoves. As they approached, the smell that drifted out to meet them made several women stop in their tracks. It was bacon frying, the rich, fatty scent mingling with the aroma of fresh coffee and something that smelled like bread toasting. For women who had subsisted on thin soup and stale rations for months, the smell was overwhelming. One prisoner, a tall woman with sharp features who had worked as a typist in Hamburg, made a show of gagging, one hand pressed dramatically to her stomach. "This is what they eat," she announced loudly in German, her voice dripping with theatrical disgust. "Fat and grease and more fat. How crude, how utterly American." The women around her laughed dutifully, some adding their own exaggerated reactions, waving hands in front of their faces as if to ward off an offensive odour. But when the line shuffled forward and the trays were actually handed out, laden with scrambled eggs still steaming, strips of bacon glistening with fat, thick slices of bread with real butter melting into the warm surface, and cups of coffee that smelled like heaven, the laughter faltered and died. The women stared down at their trays, and whatever smart remarks they had been preparing dissolved on their tongues. This was more food than many of them had seen on a single plate in years. The portions were generous, almost obscenely so, and everything was fresh and hot. They found tables and sat, some still maintaining the pretense of disdain, sniffing at the food and wrinkling their noses. But hunger was a more powerful force than pride. Within moments, forks were moving, food was being consumed with an eagerness that betrayed all their earlier mockery. The eggs were fluffy and well-seasoned. The bacon crunched between their teeth, salt and fat exploding on their taste buds. The bread was soft inside with a perfect crust. The coffee, strong and bitter, chased away the fog of poor sleep and weary minds. Greta ate slowly, trying to maintain some dignity, but she couldn't stop herself from savouring every bite. The warmth of the food spread through her body, easing aches she had barely been conscious of carrying. Around her, the other women were equally absorbed in their meals, and the barracks had fallen almost completely silent except for the sounds of eating and the occasional clink of utensils against tin trays. One of the guards, a lean man with sandy hair and a long stride, was making rounds through the mess hall, checking that the prisoners had everything they needed. When he passed near Greta's table, he noticed how quickly the women were eating, how their earlier expressions of disgust had transformed into focused consumption. A faint smile crossed his face, knowing and without malice, as if he could see through their pretense to the simple truth of their hunger. He said nothing, made no comment, but that smile carried its own message. He knew they had been playing a role. He knew they were grateful for the food, even if they couldn't admit it aloud. Several of the women caught that smile, and their cheeks flushed hot with shame that they couldn't quite explain. It wasn't mockery exactly, but rather a kind of gentle understanding that somehow felt worse than open mockery would have. It stripped away their protective layer of defiance and left them feeling exposed, vulnerable in ways that had nothing to do with their status as prisoners. When the meal was finished and they filed out of the mess hall, the women were quieter than they had been going in. Some still made half-hearted attempts at jokes about American food, about how heavy it would sit in their stomachs, about how unsophisticated the cooking was. But the words rang hollow, unconvincing even to those who spoke them. They had been fed generously, treated with a basic decency that confused and troubled them. It would have been easier in some ways if the Americans had been cruel. The afternoon brought work assignments. The prisoners were divided into groups and given various tasks around the camp: laundry duty, kitchen work, general cleaning and maintenance. The Americans made it clear through gestures and simple German phrases that everyone was expected to contribute, but the orders came without harshness, delivered in the same casual tone the guards used for everything. There was no shouting, no threats of punishment for those who worked slowly or made mistakes. Greta found herself assigned to a detail that involved hauling water from a pump to fill large barrels used for laundry. The work was hard, the buckets heavy when full, and the distance from pump to barrels felt longer with each trip. On her third journey, struggling with a particularly heavy bucket that threatened to slosh water over the sides, she felt her arms beginning to shake from the strain. She gritted her teeth, determined not to show weakness, not to ask for help that might be interpreted as surrender. But before she could take another step, an American soldier appeared at her side. He was young, probably no more than 20, with a face that still carried the softness of adolescence. Without asking permission or saying anything at all, he simply reached out and took hold of the bucket's other handle. Together, they carried it to the barrels, the weight distributed between them making the task suddenly manageable. When they reached the destination and poured the water out, he set the empty bucket down and walked away, still without having spoken a word. Greta stood frozen, staring after him, her mind struggling to process what had just happened. In her experience, soldiers, especially victorious soldiers, did not assist prisoners with their labour. They supervised. They punished slowness. They might, if feeling particularly benevolent, reduce the workload, but they did not share it. The casual way this American had simply stepped in and helped, as if it were the most natural thing in the world, as if she were not an enemy but merely another person struggling with a heavy burden, left her feeling off balance and confused. The other women in her work detail had witnessed the exchange, and that evening in the barracks it became a topic of hushed discussion. Some scoffed, insisting it was merely strategy, a way to soften them up and make them compliant. "They want us to like them," one woman declared with conviction. "They want to make us forget we're prisoners, so we'll be easier to control." Others were less certain, their voices carrying doubt. One finally admitted quietly, eyes on her hands rather than her companions. "I cannot remember the last time a man helped me carry something without expecting payment or favours in return. Not for years." The comment hung in the air, and no one quite knew how to respond to it. They all carried memories of the world they had come from, a world where kindness often came with strings attached, where gentleness was rare and usually calculated. The possibility that these American gestures might be genuine, offered without ulterior motive, was almost more disturbing than the idea that they were manipulative tactics. That night, Greta lay in her bunk and watched through the window as darkness settled over the camp. The guards were changing shifts, and she could hear them talking as they gathered near one of the barracks. She couldn't make out the words, but the tone was easy, relaxed, punctuated by occasional laughter. The sound was so different from what she had known in German military spaces, where even off-duty conversations carried a certain formality, a consciousness of rank and protocol that never quite dissolved. She found herself thinking about the freckled guard again, the one whose eyes had met hers so briefly the day before. She had seen him during the afternoon, standing watch near the fence line, and when her work detail had passed nearby, he had nodded to her. Just a small dip of his head, a simple acknowledgement that she existed, that he saw her. Nothing more than that, but the gesture had sent her heart racing in a way that made no sense, that she didn't want to examine too closely. Around her in the darkness, other women shifted and sighed, seeking comfortable positions on the thin mattresses. Someone was crying very softly, trying to muffle the sound in her blanket. Someone else whispered a prayer, the old familiar words barely audible. Gradually, the sounds of waking faded into the rhythms of restless sleep. But Greta remained awake, her mind circling around the events of the day, trying to make sense of her own reactions. Why should a simple nod matter? Why should an American's willingness to help her carry a bucket feel significant? Why was the sound of their laughter outside more disturbing than threats would have been? She whispered into the darkness, trying to convince herself, "It means nothing. They are still the enemy. This is all just confusion because everything is strange and new." But even as she formed the words, she knew she was lying to herself. Something was shifting inside her. Some fundamental assumption about how the world worked was being challenged. The Americans were supposed to be brutal victors. They were supposed to embody all the vengeful qualities that propaganda had attributed to them. Instead, they were proving to be something far more complicated, far more human, and somehow that was more threatening than any amount of cruelty could have been. Outside, a harmonica began to play again. The same instrument, or perhaps a different one, she couldn't tell. The melody was slow and sweet, almost a lullaby, and despite herself, Greta felt her eyes growing heavy. She pulled the blanket up higher and let the music carry her towards sleep, even as some part of her whispered warnings about the danger of finding comfort in sounds made by the men who held her captive. The women had laughed when they arrived, mocked their captors openly, clung to their defiance as the last remaining proof of who they had been. But laughter was fading now, replaced by something far more complex and dangerous. In its wake came curiosity, observation, the slow accumulation of small kindnesses that didn't fit the narrative they had been taught. And once the door to doubt had been opened, even just a crack, it became impossible to close again. As the second week of captivity stretched into the third, the initial shock and confusion began to settle into something resembling routine, though it remained a strange and unsettling routine that none of the women had anticipated. The daily patterns established themselves with mechanical regularity. The morning bell, the roll call, the meals, the work assignments, the evening hours in the barracks before lights out. On the surface, it was not so different from the structured existence they had known before, just with different faces giving the orders and different walls containing them. But beneath that surface regularity, currents of change flowed deep and strong. The sharp mockery that had characterized those first days had dulled considerably, worn down by the accumulating weight of small kindnesses and casual interactions that refused to fit the mold of captor-prisoner dynamics they understood. The women found themselves watching the Americans more carefully now, not with the eyes of those looking for weaknesses to ridicule, but with something closer to genuine curiosity. They began to notice details they had dismissed at first. The way one guard, a red-haired soldier with an easy smile, always made sure the coffee urn in the mess hall was full during breakfast, sometimes brewing an extra pot when he saw the line was long. How another guard, an older man who might have been in his 30s, carried himself with a weariness that suggested he wanted to be here as little as the prisoners did, his face carrying the same exhaustion and longing for home that they all felt. The guard who worked the gate had a habit of humming while he checked passes, always the same tune, something that sounded vaguely like a folk song, and the women found themselves listening for it as they came and went. Greta, during her various work assignments, had more opportunities than some to observe the Americans at close range. She noticed how they interacted with each other, the constant good-natured ribbing, the way they helped each other with tasks without being asked, the absence of the rigid hierarchy that would have characterized any German unit she had known. Rank existed, certainly, but it seemed to sit more lightly on their shoulders, worn like a comfortable coat rather than rigid armor. One afternoon, while working in the laundry facility with several other women, Greta witnessed something that stuck with her long after. One of the American soldiers, a young private tasked with delivering clean linens to various parts of the camp, was carrying an overstuffed bag when it slipped from his grip. Sheets and towels spilled across the ground, some landing in mud puddles left from the previous night's rain. The women nearby stopped working, expecting an explosion of anger or cursing. Instead, the young soldier just laughed, a surprised, embarrassed sound, and dropped to his knees to gather the soiled linens. "Well, that's just perfect," he muttered in English, shaking his head at his own clumsiness. What happened next surprised Greta even more. Another American, a corporal who technically outranked the private, came over and helped gather the fallen items without a word of reprimand. When the mess was sorted and the dirty items separated from the clean, the corporal clapped the younger man on the shoulder and said something that made them both laugh. There was no punishment, no public humiliation for the mistake. Just acceptance that accidents happened and life went on. A young German clerk named Anna, who was working at the washing station next to Greta, leaned closer and whispered, "Did you see that?" No shouting, no penalty. They just laughed about it. Her voice carried a mixture of disbelief and something else, something that might have been longing. In their previous world, such a mistake would have resulted in harsh discipline, a mark on one's record, possibly worse depending on the mood of the supervising officer. The women exchanged glances, and Greta could see her own thoughts reflected in her companion's eyes. These Americans were strange, their approach to discipline and authority so foreign it seemed almost childish. And yet there was something appealing about it too. Something that spoke to a kind of freedom they had never known, a way of moving through the world without the constant fear of punishment for every small error. During work breaks, when the women gathered in whatever shade they could find, the conversations began to shift in tone. There was still mockery, but it came more slowly now, and often it was challenged by others who pointed out counterexamples, moments of unexpected kindness or consideration. One woman mentioned how a guard had brought her a cup of water unasked when she was working in the hot sun. Another described how an American had fixed a broken step on their barracks without being ordered to, just noticing it needed repair and taking care of it. "They're trying to make us soft," insisted one woman, a former nurse named Margaret, who had maintained her rigid disapproval throughout their captivity. "Don't fall for it. These small gestures mean nothing. They're still keeping us prisoner. They're still the enemy." But her words, which would have found easy agreement 2 weeks earlier, now met with a more complicated response. Nods of acknowledgement mixed with uncertain silences, as if the women weren't sure anymore what they believed. Greta found her gaze drawn repeatedly to the freckled guard she had first noticed on their arrival. She had learned, through overheard conversations among the Americans, that his name was something like Tommy or Tony, though she wasn't quite sure of the pronunciation. He seemed to be assigned to a regular patrol route that took him past their barracks multiple times a day, and she had caught him looking toward the windows more than once. Their eyes had met several times now, these brief encounters that lasted only seconds, but felt weighted with significance she couldn't define. One particular incident crystallized something for Greta, though she fought against the implications even as they formed in her mind. She was carrying a basket of folded laundry across the compound when one of the handles broke, sending clean sheets tumbling onto the dusty ground. She dropped to her knees immediately, frantically trying to gather the linens before they became too soiled, knowing she would have to wash them all again if she couldn't salvage them. Her hands moved quickly, but there was too much, and tears of frustration burned in her eyes, though she refused to let them fall. Then there were other hands helping, and she looked up to find the freckled guard kneeling beside her, gathering sheets with the same urgency she felt. He didn't speak, just worked alongside her until everything was collected and piled back into the broken basket. When they finished, he met her eyes directly for the first time, and she saw something there that made her breath catch. It wasn't pity, wasn't condescension, wasn't even the satisfaction of a victor helping the defeated. It was just kindness. Simple, uncomplicated human kindness of the sort she had almost forgotten existed. "Thank you," she whispered in German, the words slipping out before she could stop them. He didn't understand the language, but he seemed to understand the sentiment. He nodded once, offered a small smile that made those freckles shift across his face, and then stood and walked away, returning to his patrol as if nothing significant had happened. But it had been significant, at least to Greta. She remained kneeling there for a moment longer, the basket of rescued laundry forgotten in her arms as she tried to steady her breathing and calm the sudden racing of her heart. What was wrong with her? Why should such a small gesture affect her so strongly? She forced herself to stand, to continue her task, but the memory of those blue eyes and that brief smile stayed with her. That evening, the atmosphere in the barracks had shifted noticeably. The women gathered on their bunks as usual after supper, but the conversation took on a different quality than it had in previous weeks. Anna, the young clerk who worked near Greta in the laundry, was the first to voice what several of them were thinking. "Has anyone else noticed," she began hesitantly, "that the guards leave extra bread sometimes? More than the official portion?" Several women nodded. One added, "And yesterday, when it rained during work detail, they let us wait under shelter longer than necessary before sending us back out. They didn't have to do that." "I saw one adjusting a blanket over Elke when she fell asleep on the bench outside," another contributed. "Just pulled it up over her shoulders like it was the most natural thing." "Didn't wake her or anything?" The observations accumulated, painting a picture that was difficult to reconcile with their understanding of how prisoners should be treated by victorious enemies. These weren't the actions of guards maintaining strict military discipline. These were acts of care, small gestures that suggested the Americans saw them not primarily as defeated enemies, but as human beings who were cold, tired, hungry, and far from home. Margaret, the nurse who had been most insistent on maintaining their defiance, shook her head firmly. "It's all strategy," she insisted again, but her voice carried less conviction than before. "They want us compliant. They want us to forget what we are." "And what are we?" Greta heard herself ask, the question surprising her as much as it seemed to surprise the others. "We're not soldiers. We were nurses, clerks, assistants. We're women who worked for our country and who lost. What exactly are we supposed to remember that these small kindnesses make us forget?" Silence followed her words. No one seemed to have an answer, or perhaps they had answers but were afraid to speak them aloud. The truth that was slowly dawning on them all was uncomfortable, challenging to ideas they had held without question. They had been taught to see the world in simple terms, us and them, friend and enemy, victor and vanquished. But these Americans kept refusing to play their assigned role, kept acting in ways that blurred those clear lines and introduced complications where there should have been clarity. As the women settled into their bunks for the night, the usual whispered conversations continued, but the content had changed. Instead of mockery, they spoke now in wondering tones about the Americans' strange habits, their casual way of moving through the world, the apparent ease with which kindness came to them. Some women still insisted these things meant nothing, that it was all manipulation, or that the Americans were simply too undisciplined to maintain proper prisoner-guard relations. But others had begun to admit, at least to themselves, that perhaps there was something more happening here than simple strategic softness. Greta lay in her usual position, on her side facing the window, and watched as the guards changed shifts in the evening light. The harmonica came out again. It seemed there was always someone playing it in the evenings, and the melody drifted across the compound. This time the tune was more cheerful, almost playful, and she could hear the Americans singing along to parts of it, though she couldn't make out the words. The sound shouldn't have been comforting. It should have been just noise from her captors, meaningless and easy to ignore. But instead, she found herself listening intently, letting the music fill the quiet spaces in her mind, using it to push away the confusing tangle of thoughts and feelings that threatened to overwhelm her. There was something in that music, in those careless American voices, that spoke to a life she had never known, a life where people laughed easily, where mistakes were met with humour rather than punishment, where kindness was offered without calculation or expectation of return. She thought again of the guard who had helped her with the laundry, of his hands gathering sheets alongside hers, of the smile that had been so genuine it hurt something in her chest. What kind of man smiled like that at an enemy? What kind of soldier helped a prisoner without being ordered to do so, without expecting gratitude or recognition? She had no framework for understanding such behaviour, no experience that prepared her for the possibility that the Americans might be motivated by simple human decency rather than tactical considerations. Around her, the other women were settling into sleep, their breathing gradually evening out into the rhythms of rest. But Greta remained awake longer, staring at the patterns of moonlight on the wall, listening to the distant harmonica, and grappling with the uncomfortable realization that her understanding of the world was being systematically dismantled by bacon and coffee and freckles and small kindnesses that cost her captors nothing but meant everything to women who had expected only harshness. The laughter of those first days was gone completely now, replaced by something far more complex. In its place had grown a strange mixture of confusion, curiosity, and the first tentative stirrings of something else, something that felt dangerous even to acknowledge. The women had stopped mocking their captors, not because they had been ordered to stop, but because the mockery rang false even in their own ears. How could you truly mock someone who had just shared their cigarettes with you, who had carried your heavy load without being asked, who had smiled at you as though you were worth smiling at? As sleep finally began to claim her, Greta's last conscious thought was both a warning and a question. What happens to prisoners who begin to see their captors as human? What becomes of enemies who start to recognize each other across the barriers that separate them? She had no answers, only a growing sense that something irreversible was beginning, something that would change her in ways she couldn't yet imagine, but that she was powerless to prevent. The harmonica played on into the night, and in her dreams, Greta heard it still, twining together with images of freckled faces and blue eyes and smiles that promised nothing but offered everything.